Hi, I'm Sharon Racusin and the host of Voices for Justice. The goal of this show is to allow social and economic justice activists give you an opportunity to get organized and connected to the important struggles happening in our community and in our state. You're not alone. Join us. Healthcare is a human right. Welcome. In the studio in White River Junction today with me is Fran Brokaw, retired general internist and palliative care physician at Dartmouth-Hitchcock, and Sarah Rosenstein, the founder of the Students for National Health program at Dartmouth-Geisel Medical School. Welcome. Good morning. It is morning.
Good morning.
We are going to be speaking today about a letter that was sent to the Office of the Dean of Geisel about a year and a half ago. It was August 2017, signed by hundreds of students, including student groups, regarding racism, implicit bias, and bigotry in the curricula. And I am going to address Sarah, who is going to speak about, what were the students' complaints and some examples of what is being taught. I think it's current, if I understand that. And this was in direct response to Charlottesville.
Yep.
So what demands you were making, and what was the response from Geisel?
Sure. So I was part of the students to craft the letter to the administration, and our main goals were to start a discussion with the administration on racism and bigotry in our curricula, as well as in our community. And this letter kind of came up because we heard no response from our dean to the events in Charlottesville a couple of years ago. And we'll often get responses to natural disasters, things like that. But we have students from the Charlottesville area, and this was obviously made an impact on them and the wider community, and we heard no response from the dean. So we kind of hit a boiling point then and decided to craft this letter. But the boiling point came because we had all been frustrated with some of the things that we were experiencing in the preclinical curriculum at Geisel. So I can give you examples of that.
We would love to
if you'd
hear
like.
That. Yeah.
So some of the examples is that we were being taught illness scripts for our patients. So what an illness script is kind of putting a patient into a box. So we'll be taught that only Black patients can have sickle cell anemia, when that's not wholly true. But you think in your mind when you see a Black patient who has the symptoms, oh, sickle cell anemia. And so with that illness script in your mind, you can miss a lot of other diagnoses that might be relevant to that patient. The same with sarcoidosis. So you think, when I hear sarcoidosis, in my mind, I think Black female in her 30s. And so we were being taught to profile patients in that way. And we also weren't being taught with person-first language. So a person with sarcoidosis, we were being taught that the disease is what the patient is. We also had some specific examples in our curriculum where we were being taught outdated information regarding certain medications working only for Black patients, and that you should prescribe those rather than the normal protocol, which has since been debunked. And when we brought that to our professor, there was a lot of pushback against that, and that's still being taught. Some things like, if you see the skull of a Black person, you'll be able to tell they were Black based on the features of their skull.
Well, that's about 150 years old, isn't it?
It is. So we felt like we were back in medical school in the 50s. There was also some direct actions towards students that were deemed to be inappropriate. So we had one student who had a religious first name, and a professor refused to call him by that name because he did not believe in that religion, and he told the student as such. So in that environment, we were all feeling a little bit frustrated. And so the events at Charlottesville and having no response to them had us craft this letter. Yeah.
Understandably so. So I failed to tell the audience what year you're in. You've stuck it out. You're going into your third year.
Yes.
And your activism is keeping you connected and moving forward. So what response did this letter have?
So
in the office of the dean.
The deans all came together. We have these monthly deans lunches, but they all did come to one to directly address this letter and had an open forum for students to kind of voice their concerns. And we did that. And it was kind of a tense meeting between us and the dean's office. A few things came out of it and a few things didn't.
A few positive things and a few negative things. Okay.
Okay. So there's a new curriculum coming out at Geisel. They're rolling it out this fall, and they did create an integration team to go through all of the curriculum. It's students who are doing this. So we find at Dartmouth that students do a lot of the work to push diversity forward, and it doesn't come a lot from the administration. So they set up a group of students to look through the curriculum and flag anything that seemed out of place. So that was definitely positive. And what else came out of that? Not a whole lot.
It seems like not a whole lot.
Not a whole lot. We did try really hard to get implicit bias training for all of the faculty, which is something that we don't do at Dartmouth yet. And so the response to that was, we have such a huge faculty, we could never get them all together at the same time to do this training. When we were in that dean's lunch, that was the response to that. That was actually my question. And so the dean said, we'll follow up more on this later. And so I set a meeting with her, with the diversity and inclusion reps, and my friend who worked for Google, actually implementing online programs to do trainings like this. And we cited a lot of literature in our request, and came into the meeting with the Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at the time. She's no longer currently the Dean of Diversity and Inclusion. And we were told, this all sounds great, but at the end of the day, this is the Geisel School of Medicine, and it's not the Geisel School of Social Justice. And so that's not our main priority. And you have the right here to learn the technical skills to become a doctor, and that's what we want to teach you.
So, Sarah, it sounds like, in the first place, I would say, I wanted to just make the point that the administration's lack of response is far from surprising, since they all come from that very white, patriarchal training and background. So even if they're people of color, even if they're women, even if they're queer, they come from that culture, so they don't see it. But what is interesting to me is that they declined to do implicit bias training because they thought that that was social justice related. So talk a little bit about how implicit bias could have a negative effect in the doctor-patient relationship.
Sure. So we all have implicit bias, right?
Absolutely.
And I took my little Harvard implicit bias tests, and so I know mine, and I'm careful to be aware of those, right? So everyone has them. And so say you have bias, you've grown up in a very affluent community, which I have not, but a lot of my classmates have, you're going to have an implicit bias towards people who are like you from that community, and a bias against people who aren't from that community. And you may not realize this cognitively, right? But when you have an implicit bias training, then you can become aware of these biases that you have. And so, like for me, I keep mine in mind when I'm with a patient who I know that I have maybe an implicit bias for or against. And then I'm aware of what I'm saying to that patient. So I think implicit bias training should be important for every medical professional, right? Because you can keep in mind, oh, I might have a certain bias for or against this person, and I don't want my treatment plan to be impacted by that. And so just having that little piece of information in your mind can make a big difference in how you care for a patient.
I have a question about, I know my husband, as a physician, has to go every year to do CMEs, continuing medical education. Is implicit bias training part of that anywhere? Like,
boy,
I mean, isn't that sort of...
No, it never was. When I was in practice, I stopped practicing 4 years ago, and I never heard of it. It may have been out there, and it just wasn't on my radar. I can tell you that, you know, probably 4 years ago, I didn't even really understand the words implicit bias. And I think most medical professionals generally are, especially white medical professionals, are still probably in a mind frame that if they're told they have implicit bias, where they prefer people with light skin, they react immediately by saying, "Are you telling me I'm a racist?" And there's that defensiveness that comes into play instantly. And I'll come clean and say that when I took the Harvard implicit bias test, I have regularly, unfortunately, I feel guilty about it, but there's no reason for guilt. I do have a moderate preference for people with light skin. It's my upbringing. It's where I was. But I try to be aware of it, and it's a lifelong journey.
Yeah, it really helps to be aware of it. I find in my interactions, it helps me because I have an implicit bias which was not the norm in the Harvard tests, for queer people, for people of size. I am both of those things. And I have an implicit bias slightly against men over women. And so I keep that in mind when I'm interacting with men over women and how I'm treating them and what affect I bring into the conversation. And so it's really helped me a lot to say, oh, I didn't know I had these. And now I can sort of course correct. And I don't think it says anything about who you are as a person. It says more about where you were born and raised. And those aren't things that we can choose. Now, there is explicit bias. That's a different thing. But your implicit biases are just things that have been ingrained in your mind from your lived experience. And I don't think that there's any problem with those. The only problem is not recognizing them and continuing to act upon them. And then that can negatively impact patient care.
And it especially seems important when you're in the process of, you know, a new patient who you're getting information and you're trying to make a diagnosis, because the biases that you've been taught, as well as your implicit biases, sort of do that boxing with patients.
The illness scripts that we learn about patients.
Which is just...
It's hard to get out of those once they've been taught to you. And they're reinforced in the medical boards, which I'm studying for now. You see that first line and you think, oh, these are all the illnesses that can go along with someone of those demographics. And usually the correct answer supports that.
I mean, as we know from working in with racial justice and everything that's being thrown at us. The most important thing is for people to talk and to understand. And it seems almost like a no-brainer for Dartmouth, for Geisel. I go back to Dartmouth Medical School, but Geisel's School of Medicine, for the students to really push for their instructors to have that implicit bias training and help push them in that direction. I mean, they obviously don't want to do it themselves. And the fact that they categorize it as social justice is just so
that was
so crazy.
Former Dean of Diversity and Inclusion, and we have had some positive changes in that avenue as well. So they're now giving students implicit bias training. It's not faculty, but students.
That's a step.
It is a step. So I just had it on Tuesday for my third-year orientation, and it was a good training on implicit bias. So it's kind of a double standard that we're getting it, and our physicians who are grading us aren't, but you know, it's definitely a step in the right direction in educating future physicians so that does have a change. It was funny though, in all the other sessions in our third-year orientation over 2 days, students were so eager to raise their hand and answer a question, and students were silent in this session. And you could tell even among students, like, this is an uncomfortable topic. And so I think, like you said, the more we can open a dialogue around these things, the more comfortable people can be in addressing them and learning. And so I think that's really important.
And that silence was across the board, regardless of racial or ethnic identity or things like that?
No. No, it was not.
Do say more.
Yes. Fill in the gaps here.
Yeah. So I think it's often put on the shoulders of those in minority groups to advocate for themselves.
Absolutely.
And so we saw a lot of that happening in that training. And, you know, we had a student step up and say, could we hear, so the first 5 people to answer questions were white men about a case on sexism, and we did have one student stand up and say, could we hear the voices of some women for that? So that was great, but we did have a lot of students from minority groups advocating for themselves and actually asking for advocates. That was the last comment that was made from a black student. He said, you know, I think the burden is often put on us as diverse students to advocate for ourselves, but what would be really great would be to have students who don't come from our intersections also stand up and advocate for us. And those were the people who were kind of quiet throughout the training.
Yeah.
So
To be allies.
Yeah, and this is probably the first time they've ever been put in that situation. And feeling like a minority in a way. You know, that all of a sudden, that uncomfortableness, it's like, I never had to think about this before, now what do I do?
yeah.
Yeah.
But-
Or, that's not me, or, you know, the defensiveness. There's a whole lot of emotions going on at that moment. Is it one training, or is like the beginning of the year and then that's it, or is it going to be ongoing?
I'm not sure yet, honestly. For our orientation, it was just one training.
So like
Probably
one
not
training,
enough.
1 hour?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is much more than we got. We got nothing on that in our orientation to medical school. So I definitely see that as forward progress in the medical school, because that was something I was really surprised that we didn't have. I didn't know coming in really what I was getting into, but I was surprised that that wasn't a part of orientation at all. So it was nice to see it in this orientation, and I think, you know, there is some receptivity from certain administrators to students' needs in this area, which is a nice change. I think it's probably behind the curve of a lot of organizations, generally, not just medical organizations, but it is change and progress that is moving forward.
When you meet students from other medical schools, and in your role as the founder of the Students for National Health program, which is something we're not even talking about, but this is all about healthcare. It's just it's the training part. And is Dartmouth set aside? Is Dartmouth different from the other training programs?
So I think it depends school to school. There are some very progressive medical schools out there. UCSF comes to mind. They usually spearhead all of these campaigns. And then there's some schools in more red states where they look at Dartmouth and they say, wow, you're far ahead of us in your education. So I think it depends school to school, but hopefully we move towards the schools that are making the more positive and progressive for medicine changes.
So are there any additional venues planned for meeting with the deans? And is there a new dean of diversity and inclusion?
There is Dr. Stephanie White. She's fabulous.
Okay. Oh, good.
So that is definitely an improvement there. And she's the one who ran this implicit bias training for us in our third year. And she's been just a good ally for students who are maybe from minority groups to come and talk to. Yeah.
Have you spoken to her about training for the professors? And do you know how she feels about that? I mean, it seems like that's the obvious question to me, but...
So I haven't spoken directly to her about that. She did ask me about my experience at Geisel once, and I was kind of heartened to hear that she brought it up in a meeting to all the deans. So, yeah.
Well, it took almost 2 years, but...
There are some positive changes, and I feel proud, and I'm proud of all the other students who came together to either craft the letter or to sign, because putting your name on something like that is exposing yourself. And at the bottom of the food chain, medical students don't often want to expose themselves to any scrutiny. So it was brave of everyone to sign, and I think it has definitely led to some positive changes. We have a long way to go, but it is something that has had an impact in probably more ways than I know right now.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Every step
this.
matters.
Yeah.
It
really does. And,
yes.
And so celebrating those small steps is really important in being able to stay in the work for the long haul.
Sure.
Right, and this isn't even, I mean, your passion, I know, is medicine, obviously, and people. But, you know, we need a national health program.
Yes, we do.
We need universal health care. And the universe includes everyone of every different stripe and color and being. And, you know, if we can't get past that, we're never going to get to the thing, to the ultimate goal.
Yeah, and I think especially for medical students, that starts in your education, right? So if we're taught about illness scripts and to be aware of them and about implicit bias, then hopefully we can go on to be teachers one day and to not perpetuate the older norms that we have been taught in medical education. So, you know, changing the curriculum, having implicit bias training, and you know, just being aware of illness scripts and how you interact with patients who look different from you, come from different cultures and backgrounds and ethnicities, I think then that can have just a massive effect on medicine overall. So that's really important to me. And medicine is my passion, but also advocacy. So I hope to be a physician advocate for some of these changes one day.
Sarah, thank you for this insight into medical education. It's been eye-opening, and you are a champion and I'm so glad
Yeah.
to know you.
Thank you, Sharon.
We will tune in to the next show where we talk more about diversity and how the student body is, what type of diversity the student body is made of, and what kind of challenges the students face. So until that next show, bye-bye.
Thank you.